no, we talk about UEFI versus traditional BIOS systems. There's no such thing really as UEFI mode, but for us, because Arca OS can install either way, we tend to look for phrases that sort of fit, and the term mode has just sort of stuck for many of us. So if I say mode, all I'm talking about is setting the system BIOS to boot UEFI versus what's often termed legacy mode. At Arkanoa, of course, everyone knows we do not believe in the term legacy. Legacy is what's left over after everyone's left the building. So OS2 and Arca OS is not legacy software to us, it's the stuff we currently do. So hopefully this will give people some guidelines as to how they should install Arca OS 5.1. UEFI has been promoted here and there in public discussions as sort of the be-all and end-all of environments for Arca OS, and it's not. That's not to say that we don't advise using it, but there are times when it's appropriate and times when it's not necessarily appropriate. So hopefully this will answer some of those questions. So traditional BIOS. We talk about UEFI versus traditional BIOS. The traditional BIOS is the standard hardware supplied basic input-output system. IBM PCs have a BIOS chip in them. On modern hardware, we see this provided as a compatibility support module, a CSM. If you go into the system BIOS, typically you'll have an option to turn that on or off. Not all machines give you that option to turn on or off. If there's no option to turn it off, to turn it on, and there's no legacy mode option in the BIOS, then you're sort of stuck with a UEFI only system, and you have to use UEFI. The CSM may or may not be a complete replacement for the PC BIOS. It all depends upon the machine. And OS2 requires certain things to be available, certain BIOS services. So what our approach with Arca OS was to provide a compatibility layer so that we didn't change anything in the underlying operating system. We provided an expected environment for Arca OS to boot. UEFI is the extensible firmware interface. UEFI has been with us for over a decade now, maybe decade. To, if it's booting from a hard disk, it looks for an MBR partitioned drive, and it will look for either primary partition and that's flagged active to boot, or a boot manager that's. UEFI doesn't do that because UEFI doesn't. UEFI supports GPT, and GPT doesn't have a sense of primaries and logicals or anything like that. So the boot process is different. UEFI uses an ESP, which is the EFI system partition, and that's where the UEFI environment is created on that ESP. So what does the Arkanoa UEFI solution do for us? It consists of ANCS, which is the Arkanoa compatibility system. It allows us to boot from an ESP. It provides a full 64-bit UEFI environment, which then boots Arca OS, which is still 32-bit. It's multi-boot compliant, so as long as you've got a boot manager, you can boot other UEFI operating systems. Arca OS can be on the same disk, and you can boot whichever one you want. And Arca OS itself is exactly the same whether you're installing in a traditional BIOS environment or you're installing under UEFI. So you shouldn't think that there's any change to the underlying operating system. It's all a matter of how we get there. So when should you use UEFI? Well, when you have other UEFI dependent operating systems already on the disk and you're not adding another disk to the system, so you've got one hard drive in the system, the other operating systems are UEFI, you've got to be able to boot off of that device. It's impractical to install a non-UEFI aware system, so UEFI makes sense in that case. I mentioned before, when legacy mode isn't available in the BIOS as an option, that machine is pretty much what it is. When you need DOS and WinOS 2 sessions, more modern machines have often display issues getting full DOS and WinOS 2 support. And why WinOS 2 support? Because WinOS 2 runs on top of DOS, and so it's the same problem. The Arkanoa compatibility system provides those missing pieces so that DOS and WinOS 2 sessions come up the way you would expect them to come up. And if you have a huge storage device, let's say you've got a machine that's got a 12 terabyte drive in it, and you want to use all of that storage space, and it's partitioned GPT, and there are 4 huge pieces, 4 huge partitions on it, we can utilize that with our GPT filter for Arca OS. And if you're going to boot from a GPT device, then you need to use the UEFI Arkanoa compatibility system. Now, the other thing is, one of our limitations that we're running into is the memory mapping in a lot of these new systems. When we boot UEFI, we find that the system's got 1.5 or 1.7 gigabytes available, even though there's 16 gigabytes installed in the machine. And you can add all that other memory to a PAE RAM disk, but you're still limited to 1.5 gigabytes of system memory under the 4 gigabyte boundary. If that's not an issue for you, then UEFI is fine. When should you not use UEFI? Well, let me put it to you this way. If you don't need to use UEFI, don't. That's the rule of thumb. If you don't need to use it, don't use it. When you've got a fully compliant BIOS-capable system with no UEFI OSs on it, and you're only going to install Arca OS on it, then why would you install UEFI?
Well, you get the full color boot logo.
Yeah, there's that. There's that. If you have a machine that's got an early UEFI implementation, for instance, one of my test machines was an older HP laptop, and HP even provided a warning in the BIOS that you should not use the UEFI environment except for development and testing. And we don't boot well on that machine. It's just strange, the things that happen. But there's no reason to use it. You just turn it off and you install normally, and the system boots up and it works and it's fine. If you don't need DOS or WinOS 2, then the whole DOS or WinOS 2 session issue is beside the fact. If you're not using DOS or WinOS 2, who cares whether it works or not? If you don't need to boot from a GPT device, let's say you've got 2 drives in the machine. I mean, you can use GPT partitions for data partitions under Arca OS no matter how you boot. So if you don't need to boot from that device and you have a separate disk installed in the machine that's MBR, boot from that and put all your data on GPT partitions if you want. You can create multiple partitions up to 2 terabytes in size on a single GPT device that could be 12 or 16 terabytes. I mean, I'm a huge RAID guy, so I don't like putting a lot of data on what we used to call on one spindle. Of course, now everything's solid state, so who cares about spindles? And it's just sort of terrifying to me to think about all of those terabytes of data as a single point of failure in one device. But if you've got one of those big disks and you want to use it, and you still have the ability, I should say, to put an MBR drive in the machine and boot from that, then by all means don't feel like you're required to boot GPT. There's no reason to do it. And if you want to get the maximum amount of system RAM available, your best chance of that happening is with a traditional BIOS install, not using UEFI. So if you're going to check for UEFI compatibility, how well is that system going to behave one way versus the other? Access to the hardware is really, not only is it a huge plus, as it says on the slide, but it's really key. If you can get to the machine and you can get an Arca OS 5.1 USB stick and put that in and boot in UEFI mode from that, one of the tools that we provide that David has put together for us is the system evaluation tool, and he will talk about that in detail tomorrow. But it gives you a good preview as to what your chance of success may be with that hardware and what you're likely to see happen. So a little bit about GPT, the GUID partition table versus master boot record. As I mentioned before, and the way I like to phrase it is that all partitions are created equal. All of that means is that there is no concept of primary and logical partitions, primary extended partitions. It makes no difference in GPT. A partition is a partition. What is different is that each type of partition has a unique ID, a globally unique ID, or GUID, hence the term GUID partition table. The Arca OS Type 1 partition that we use has a unique identifier. And in fact, if you go to Wikipedia and you look up GUID partition table, and you scroll down the page to look at partition types, you will see Arca OS has its GUID listed in the table. All you need to do is make it publicly known that this is the GUID that you're using. It's not like I have to register that with any grand organization or anything. Most new hardware is coming with systems that are set up for GPT, not MBR. And now, if you're going to install that way under UEFI, you're going to boot from that device. You don't need to reformat anything to get it there. It's already set up for you. How do we access GPT devices? We have a filter, and the filter allows us to see a partition on a GUID partitioned device as a virtual disk drive. So you can't create partitions in that partition, but that partition will have you can assign a letter to that partition, and that will be a virtual drive for Arca OS to use. I use the term virtual drive only to underscore the part that you can't create partitions within that partition. So if you create a GUID partition and you give it the letter D, you can't create other partitions underneath that. If you can create, you would on an MBR disk, you could create an extended partition. You could put logical partitions inside that, or you could have one big hard drive and split that up into a primary and logicals from there. With a GPT disk, you're going to carve that up. You're going to make one partition, give it a letter, and that's what it is. It can coexist with MBR devices, so you can have multiple hard drives in the system. The only restriction is you cannot boot from a GPT device from traditional BIOS, a traditional BIOS install. And that's not a limitation of Arca OS. I don't know that there's another operating system that can do that. And it is, the GPT solution is fully supported in the Arca OS installer. Limitations.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What's the overhead of that filter driver? Will it very little?
It's,
I can go over that tomorrow.
Okay.
yeah, okay, thank you. Saved. I think like everything else, it depends. But
Okay.
I'll leave it to David to clarify that. There is no removable support using the filter driver. The filter driver will snag a GPT partition, but it has no mechanism to release it or to grab one after the system boots. So there's no removable support. Whether we end up at any time having removable support is unknown, but I would say unlikely, David.
Mm-hmm.
It's challenging.
There's a lot more that goes, you don't really think about it. When you take a USB stick and stick it in the side of the machine and you eject it, you don't really think there's so much going on.
There's a lot going on. I can go over that tomorrow too.
Good. There's just so much that happens that of which we are blissfully unaware when it works right, that when you start to break it down and you say, well, we want to implement a GPT filter driver and we ought to have it work for removables too. Oh yeah, that sounds great. And then you get into the mud of the whole thing and you realize what has to happen for that to work. And then you think, so how important is this in the grand scheme of things? Okay, I skipped a few bullet points in between. UEFI requires a UEFI-aware boot manager in the ESP. Now you need to tell the BIOS, you need to point the BIOS to where the ESP is located. And then in the ESP, one of your UEFI applications is a boot manager. And that will allow you to select what operating system you want to boot from there. We provide AN Launcher, which is a very minimal boot manager. It works, it gets the job done. It was never meant to be the be-all and end-all of boot managers. But installing one of the more capable boot managers becomes problematic unto itself. So whether we ultimately package something like that later on, I don't know. Neil, you're using Refind.
Right.
Yeah. I sort of like Refind myself, but it's not easy to shoehorn it into the system. So making all of that happen so that the average Joe downloading an Arca OS license can install and then get Refine running is a bit of a project unto itself. People say, well, why can't you just use AirBoot? Well, AirBoot isn't UEFI compliant. There's no way that it can work. Track 0 doesn't have any meaning in the GPT world, so that's not going to help. Partitions are still limited to 2 terabytes. What we've done with the filter is we see the entire size of the device if it's a 16 terabyte device, but there's a far cry between recognizing a device of 16 terabytes in size and creating a file system greater than 2 terabytes. So what we do instead is we say, okay, you can take that 16 terabytes, you can carve it up into as many 2 terabyte pieces as you like. And yes, before someone asks, you can create a 512 a gigabyte GPT partition. You're not required to create a 2 terabyte GPT partition. The idea is that you can create up to a 2 terabyte GPT partition and multiples of those. So you could have D, E, F, G, H, and each one of them could be 2 terabytes. You can't span partitions. And you know, when partition spanning was first made available to OS2, there was some sense to it because our disk drives weren't as large as they are now, so being able to span a file system across multiple devices and then multiple partitions made some sense. It really doesn't anymore. And as someone who lost a tremendous amount of data on spanned disks, when the spanning broke between the pieces, yeah, I think I've changed my mind on disk partition spanning.
Well, I did some testing the other day. I took two 2 terabyte drives, not using GPT, just two 2 terabyte drives, and spanned the JFS across them, and it will allow you to span them. But
Right.
it actually makes the overall size smaller than the original was, and then unreadable.
Ah, good. I'm so glad to hear that that's so helpful.
That's great.
So, were you able to recover from
I
that?
had nothing on it. I was doing testing, so.
Be interested to, I don't know how you can, once you span volumes, I don't know that you can unspan. You can't. Once they're connected, they're connected.
It was a partial implementation, I guess.
Oops.
Yeah,
IBM's standard answer would be, well, we assumed that some enterprising company would come along and finish the work.
Well, actually, like I said, both of them are 2 terabytes. So what I think happened is that it hit the fact that the JFS theoretically can handle much larger, but on OS2, 2 terabytes
Right.
is the limit. And so once you pass over that 2 terabyte limit, it then choked.
Yeah, it may very well have a complete JFS file system that is that large, but OS2 isn't going to see a complete JFS file system larger than 2 terabytes. That's probably what it is. And there's some overhead for the spanning, so you're going to lose some of the space in between. I said that before, there's no removable support. And there's a potential performance bottleneck, and David will talk about that tomorrow. A lot of people tie GPT to UEFI, but they really have very little to do with one another, other than the fact that you can boot UEFI from GPT. There's no other correlation between them. GPT is fine for non-UEFI aware operating systems for data volumes, assuming they can read GPT devices. We can do that with Arca OS. So you could, as I said before, if you say, well, I want to install UEFI because I have a 12 terabyte drive and I want to be able to use it. Okay, so you have a 12 terabyte drive. So put in a 2 terabyte NBR disk, boot from that, less than 2 terabytes. Find something less than 2 terabytes. Boot from that, NBR, and then carve up your 12 terabyte drive into as many GPT partitions as you like. And you still don't need UEFI. As long as you're not planning to boot from it, you don't need GPT. GPT partition handling for Arca OS is limited to Arca OS supplied tools. Do not create a GPT partition from Windows or Linux and expect Arca OS to just magically work from that. There's extra stuff that we require that we install to the partition. What do we?
I go over that too.
Good. There are. You will run into problems as you usually do when you use non-Arca OS tools to manipulate Arca OS disks. Full disk imaging is not going to be possible from an Arca OS boot. So if you have a 12 terabyte disk, 12 terabyte device, and you want to create an image of that device, you're not going to be able to boot Arca OS and create your image from that. You'll have to use something else if you want to create the image. Nice thing about images, though, is that images are just byte copies, so it shouldn't matter what you do for that. I mentioned this about ESP sizes only because I noticed that there was a discussion on the DFC. Was it on the DFC list? Yeah. About the ESP being too small? There are instances where there will be an existing ESP on the disk created by something else, Windows, Linux, that is small. And when you start adding operating systems, I know David doesn't believe me, right?
No,
oh, okay.
It's possible. No, when you say too small for what?
Too small for
Too small for all your videos files and stuff?
For UEFI, for all the stuff that you shouldn't be copying to the ESP. Right. I mean, that's really the whole point of it is that under normal conditions, the ESP does not need to be large at all. In fact, we create by default, 256? That's more than enough space. Now, if you, for some reason, have something that's got like a really tiny ESP on it, yeah, you may run into problems. Manipulating the ESP to resize it or something like that is not a good idea. What you're going to want to do is create another ESP and move the content of your existing ESP to the other one. Yes, Howard.
On the second point there, does DFC count as Arca OS supplied?
No, not right now. Not right now.
Not yet.
Joe, you had a question?
How would that work? You'd make another partition larger than ESP, format for ESP, and then you'd use
That's not going to work.
DFC to.
That won't work.
No answer is a clear answer. Thank you.
You need, if you use the Arca OS installer to create another ESP, use the installation volume manager to create another ESP. That will create another ESP for you.
Okay, so I can have two on the disk?
Yes.
You can have multiple ESPs. There's nothing in the spec that says that you are limited to one ESP. But multiple ESPs are never recommended.
Because it gets confusing as hell.
It gets really confusing. You have to make sure that your BIOS boot menu is pointing to the correct ESP in order to boot what you think you should be booting.
Do you call that ESPN logic?
Oh, that one hurt. That one hurt. So what you're going to want to do is use the ArcOS installation volume manager to create a larger ESP, and then assign a drive letter to it, copy the content of your existing ESP to that one, and get rid of your old too small
No,
ESP.
that won't work.
That won't work either?
That's what I was thinking of doing, so that won't work.
That won't
Okay.
work.
Are you going to talk about this tomorrow?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So tomorrow you'll get the definitive answer.
Don't do it.
David had to actually take a deep dive into all this stuff. So after his deep immersion in it, I didn't even ask any questions. I said, can this work? And I just take his word for it. So
Yeah, that's good. I'm happy with it. I'm happy with the clear answer.
On my ESP partition, I've got a beautiful ESXi, 1.7 megabytes is used, the rest of the 100 megabytes. That's it.
the real reason for this bullet point is that the idea of resizing the ESP is it's not a good idea. It's not. If you end up with a non-bootable system afterwards, recovery becomes difficult.
Not so bad, but.
And the first Windows 10 machine I had to work on where the ESP got fouled up that way
Oh, yeah.
was just, I had to resort to the Microsoft method. Reinstall the operating system. So,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, that's it. Under normal circumstances, your ESP should be of sufficient size, should be fine. And there's nothing really special about the ESP. It's a FAT formatted partition. Typically FAT32. Why? Because FAT32 has long file name support. Isn't that why? It's not why. I'm batting 1,000 today. It can be FAT16 though.
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
It just has to be something the BIOS can read.
Yeah. Okay. UEFI, DOS, and Windows 2 support. So we have a whole bunch of different tricks for getting DOS sessions to work on systems where they would otherwise refuse to start. You don't need to do any of that stuff with UEFI. The Arcanoid compatibility system provides an expected environment so that the system can just open a DOS session and open a Windows 2 session, windowed or full screen, without any fooling around with the auto exec bat and weird DOS session settings. It just works. It just works. That was one of the goals of the UEFI compatibility, the Arcanoid compatibility system. We do provide additional DOS or Windows 2 session settings. If you're running timing sensitive things like games, you can fine tune some of that stuff. Matt has a session planned for tomorrow to talk about games, and he's done some extensive playing with various things, and he'll have more to say about those tuning settings tomorrow. Full screen isn't really what we think of as full screen in a traditional sense. It's really just a window on your desktop, but it consumes the full screen between the window and the bars on the side of it. So in other words, you're not going to get a full screen, widescreen DOS session. You'll get a 4x3 DOS session with black bars on the side, just like you'd get on a widescreen TV when you're watching 4:3 TV. And you can change the alignment. By default, it's centered, but there is a VEFI full screen align key that you can use, so you can move it to the right, move it to the left if you want. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but we have a setting to allow you to do that. There are still some timing sensitive games that do not run quite well under ANCS yet. But we're working on it. Expect that to improve. Traditional BIOS considerations. If your system can boot that way, and ArcOS boots that way, use it. If you have no real reason to use UEFI, don't. That's just the standard rule of thumb. If you're going to boot traditional BIOS, you need to boot from an MBR device. You cannot boot from a GPT device. Yes, Dave?
What overhead is there in using DOS and Windows 2?
What overhead is there?
Yeah, I mean, do you get more resources if you don't install those two things?
No.
There are a few mini VDDs that are loaded.
Even if you deselect the DOS and WinOS 2 subsystems during installation, there is a minimal DOS environment that's installed with OS 2. And you're just going to get that. If you opt to install DOS and WinOS 2 support and you don't use it, you won't notice any difference in the system whatsoever. The thing to remember is that if you do have a need for DOS and WinOS 2, the DOS VDM, virtual DOS machine in OS 2, is really very efficient. It's really very good. It is truly, as IBM touted it, to be a better DOS than DOS. And DOS and WinOS 2 may or may not function on a traditional BIOS system as you expect, as in unable to create DOS session. You know, the window won't open, whatever. And you might need to tweak that with some of the tips that we have there in the wiki. There are some things that you can try to do that may get the job done. It depends upon the system. My T43 does DOS and WinOS 2 flawlessly, but my T43 is a circa 2006 machine, and she chews up fans like there's no tomorrow. I mean, even the brand new fans that came over from China when IBM was manufacturing those machines, even if it's in a brand new IBM box, that fan's going to last me like 3 months before it starts. Wah!
Wow. You must be getting good at it.
I can change those fans in my sleep.
Wow.
I have changed so many of those stupid fans. And yeah, the one I've got in there right now is starting to make some noise already. You know, it's getting to that point. But it runs DOS and WinOS 2 like there's no tomorrow. And if I don't use Union, I use the Crystal Semi audio driver. I can run audio in my DOS and WinOS 2 sessions with no problem. It's a great machine, but those machines are, you know, they're aging rapidly, and who knows how long a fair number of them are still going to be usable for us. We'll have to see. But as I say, if you've got a system that will boot ArcOS traditional BIOS mode and everything works on it, then why install UEFI? I mean, it's senseless. UEFI, yes, it allows us to install on more hardware than we could install on otherwise. That's the thing to remember. And if you've got Windows 11 on a machine, and the machine is UEFI because Microsoft will not allow you to boot anything other than UEFI or Windows 11, and you want to install ArcOS on the same machine, and you only have one disk in the machine, you're sort of stuck with a UEFI machine. Well, now you can do that. You can install ArcOS alongside it. So here's an example, and just a few quick examples for you. So you have a modern laptop, it's 1 to 3 years old, it's got no CSM. You go into the BIOS, because we say to you, well, check and see if there's a CSM there, because if there is, you should try to enable it. And you can't find any setting for that whatsoever. In fact, you don't even see a legacy mode option in the machine. You're gonna need to install UEFI. It's not, there's no other way to do it, okay? By the way, that is not hardware that we would recommend for Arca OS. But if you've got the machine and you want to install on it, that's what you have to do, UEFI.
So who's making the hardware that you approve? Not the people who are vast.
Well, you know,
Who are they?
the manufacturer, Lenovo will manufacture machines like that and capable machines. You want a capable machine, an industry standard commercial grade system to run Arca OS. Gaming laptops are going to be problematic. I'll tell you that from the get-go. Machines that are meant to run Windows games and stuff, it's going to be problematic.
Oh, so how do you know we're doing it in a machine?
You go to the store where the machine is located and you take that Arca OS 5.1 installation USB stick, jam it in the side and boot the thing, and then use the system evaluation tool as a guide, But poking around in the BIOS will tell you a lot about how flexible the machine is. I mean, it will tell you you'll see right away whether there's a CSM selection and whether you can enable the CSM and UEFI independently, or whether, you know, I can't tell you the number of combinations that different manufacturers use and how they obscure various things. But a system like this, you know, Lenovo can make a system like this, and it can make a system that is very compatible for us. It all depends upon what the model is.
So you wouldn't know until you had access to the machine. You can't tell from the specs.
No, because those specs are rarely published by the manufacturers. Joe, you have a question?
Guide where they give you a layout of the old BIOS, so to speak, the UEFI.
A lot of cases,
You don't have those anymore?
a lot of cases, Lenovo does have a BIOS simulator where you can look up some of the models and see all the menu options.
Because what I used to do is used to go into the user's guide, you know.
I checked a couple of them, of the cheaper vendors, and also the better ones like Asus, and they just talk generally, you can go into the BIOS, press option blah,
That's
and
what they say.
that's
That's all the information they give you. Right.
Well-
That's, I think I've been catching that once in a while.
So in the old days, we would get the motherboard guide for a motherboard, we'd find all the BIOS poop we want. With the new systems today, there's the user documentation and then there's the advanced docs, and you just have to dig.
even those of some vendors are very well.
Usually they have a set where you can get to, if you can just get to that information. It's there. Like on a Dell laptop, I can go dig deep in the
Yeah, if you dig
valves
deep,
and
yeah,
find
yeah.
the documentation that tells me how their BIOS works, whether it's BIOS or UEFI or whatever. But it's hard, it's not easy,
Yeah,
but it
Yeah.
should be there.
Mind if I make a comment?
please.
The bottom line is, it really doesn't matter a whole lot. With Arca OS 5.1, you can install on pretty much whatever system you get. The point here, I think Lewis is trying to make, is that if you've got a system that's already running in traditional mode, it's already installed, there is no reason whatsoever to change it to run in UEFI mode.
Right. That really is the bottom line.
That's the bottom line.
If it works, don't fix it.
Because it's not gonna make any
Yeah.
difference.
Exactly. It's not going to run hyper fast if you install UEFI. Oh, I'm going to switch to UEFI mode, then everything's going to happen in half the time.
No.
Doesn't work that way.
No.
Doesn't work that way.
But I was looking at a different problem, which is, okay, I'm 80 years old. I got another 20 years to go, I think. My mother died at 95 after smoking 60 years. So are we going to come to the point where no units will be available in the marketplace which can move to legacy?
Yes, we will, when we
Sure.
stop making x86 compatible CPUs.
And when will that, what year will that be? I'm gonna just stock up on old computers. I need to know when they.
200 or so.
Yeah, x86 compatibility is not going away in the
No, I
near
think
future.
you meant the legacy, CSM.
But it doesn't matter, right? The only time that they'll build systems that we can't run on is when they stop making x86 compatible hardware.
But it's more than that, it's the BIOS chip that's installed.
No, not anymore.
They
No.
don't care.
Because we have the ability to boot on UEFI systems where we could not boot before.
Okay, the CSM is talking, this is without CSM, if it has no CSM, that's when the ANCS kicks in.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Before 5.10, we would not be able to install on this system whatsoever.
Okay,
Couldn't
maybe
boot.
that was the thing I was remembering.
You'd put the installed DVD in the machine, assuming it had a DVD, and you'd try to boot from it, and
You would ignore it.
exactly, it would just skip over the disk. It wouldn't boot. Couldn't boot. Now we can boot.
Going back to what Andy said, so if you have a machine that has a CSM
Mhm.
and you enable UEFI,
Mhm.
then it uses the CSM, it doesn't use any of the,
If it can, yeah.
If
All machines allow that.
is that what you're gonna cover tomorrow, Dave?
Yes.
Yes, yes. I'm going to leave the specifics to David because he really, he's earned that.
Okay, I will anxiously await tomorrow's presentation.
But we started down this path with Arca OS because we saw that there were new machines coming to market that were essentially UEFI only. There was no way to boot anything that was not UEFI aware at all, period. They were just not usable for an operating system that was not UEFI aware. And our goal was to make Arca OS bootable with the fewest changes to the operating system itself as possible. Because we didn't want to have to go monkeying with all of the operating system boot files. The way you do that is you create an environment that is optimal for the operating system. You don't make the operating system conform to the firmware. So that's where ANCS comes in. It allows us to boot Arca OS in an expected environment.
Right, and if they happen to come up with another type of BIOS that's incompatible, we'll just do it again.
Exactly. Howard.
Do we know what problems UEFI was designed to solve?
Wikipedia's your friend.
Yes. Security mostly.
Yeah, well, Secure Boot works with UEFI. It-
Mostly to solve problems that people hack into your
Yeah.
computer. Viruses.
You can't execute only signed boot files in traditional BIOS mode. That requires UEFI. And that's Secure Boot. And we do support Secure Boot. We just don't have native tools yet to install the certificates for Secure Boot.
Yes, we do.
Well,
Everybody, here's an invitation, at least for after the meeting. If anybody has a system with UEFI and wants to test Secure Boot, come to me, I can give it on a stick, and then we can test it here for good laughter and fun and see if it works. They're not officially released, but that's for.
that's the point. Those tools are not officially released yet. But yes, Secure Boot is the thing. Remember, when the whole Secure Boot thing came out, Microsoft was the only entity allowed to sign, allowed. They decided they were the only ones allowed to sign kernel files to boot on hardware. And then there was a big to-do in the Linux community about it because no one running Linux wanted to have to pay Microsoft to sign kernel files so that they could boot. So we have the ability to install third-party certificates in UEFI systems for Secure Boot. That's it in a nutshell. So this is example one. I want to get through these other ones real quick so we can move on. How am I doing on time? I don't have
You're way over.
Awful.
I was hoping I was going to go quickly here. So, you have, again, a modern laptop. You do have a CSM available, but some hardware doesn't work. You boot it up and you find that stuff doesn't work. Well, boot it in UEFI mode and see what happens. you may need to install in UEFI mode to get the rest of the hardware to properly function. UEFI is not recommended. So you've got an older laptop, 10 to 14 years of age. It's touted as UEFI capable, but UEFI from that era is not UEFI like we have today. Remember, UEFI is Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. It was really Extensible Firmware Interface. It became unified after the fact. So EFI is not necessarily UEFI. Generally, that system is going to install traditional BIOS mode just fine. So avoid UEFI. Just avoid it. Now you've got a ThinkPad T42, T43. What's UEFI? I mean, if I go to the BIOS of my T43, there's no option for UEFI. What am I worried about? Just install traditional BIOS. It will work fine. OS2 will, Arca OS, forget OS2, because getting Warp 4 to shoehorn into something even 15 years old is a feat unto itself. Arca OS will install just fine on this machine, 15 to 20 years old. Not a problem whatsoever. Just put the USB stick in, boot it up, and install. The neat thing about the installation media is it's hybrid, so whether your machine is UEFI or traditional BIOS, it's the same installation media. The system will boot however which way it boots. When it boots up in under UEFI, a lot of people say to us, how do I know whether my system is booting UEFI or traditional BIOS? There are a few pointers along the way. When it boots up, the initial boot menu, if it's UEFI, there's a text string down at the bottom of the screen that will give you key hints. That's for UEFI. You don't get that on traditional BIOS.
It'll give you what?
Hints for what keys to press.
Oh.
So escape for timeout, it's printed down at the bottom of the screen. If you go into the pre-boot menus, down in the lower right, it will say UEFI mode, or UEFI in the lower right of the screen in the pre-boot menus. And then you'll know that you're booted UEFI.
Can we go back a second? Installing Arca OS 5.1, say, on an old machine. I got a lot of old machines I can use and things.
You won't need UEFI.
Oh, no, there's no UEFI. I'm talking about T42, T43, T30. So what is the RAM requirement for Arca OS compared to the old OS2? Because the old OS2 were great on these machines.
Okay, the old OS2, IBM would have told you that your minimum RAM requirement was like 4 megabytes, and they would recommend 8 megabytes.
It was not installable on those machines. T43, you couldn't put 8 on.
Yeah,
Couldn't put what on?
You could.
Oh, excuse me, we're talking about megabytes.
Yeah.
Megabytes.
Excuse me.
If you go to the Arca OS wiki, you'll see what our minimum recommended RAM is. We don't have, I don't think that we've published minimum requirements because we really haven't tested how small you could possibly install it. But, I mean, you could install Arca OS under if you have 512 megs in the machine, you could install Arca
I
OS.
don't think it's actually the OS that's the limitation, it's the big blown up apps.
Yeah, exactly. It's what you want to run on it that really makes the difference. Sure, I can install Arca OS at 512 megabytes of RAM, but then when I open up OpenOffice, I can't do anything else, including load a document.
Excuse me, my fault. My first hard drive was 5 megabytes because I couldn't afford a 10 megabyte drive.
Yeah, I hear you. These older systems that are 15 to 20 years old, are not our primary focus. So, if you have an older machine like that and Arca OS is kind of flaky when you get it installed, please don't open a bug report for us. Please don't open a bug report. You know, it could be anything from flaky hardware in a machine that old, leaky caps, I mean, you name it. Hairline crack in the motherboard. My Arca OS boots up fine and then it freezes 15 minutes later. Yeah, because your board warmed up and you've got a hairline crack in the motherboard, a stress crack from the one-handed grab, as we call it. That's when you pick up your ThinkPad with one hand and you don't realize how much stress you're putting on that board inside there. And, you know, there's all sorts of things that can happen to a 15 to 20-year-old machine. How many of 15 to 20-year-old machines are there out there in the universe?
Apparently a lot of them, because there's still some of the.
No, they're all in your garage.
No, I can tell because there's some, the ones that are not a lot out there, they don't sell batteries for anymore. But for T43s.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You can still
the
get
Chinese
batteries.
are selling batteries. And A20, there are none left because they don't sell the batteries for them. I got A20s, A21s. You can't get batteries for them anymore. I keep them because they're 3-spindle machines.
Yeah, that's true.
They're
That's
the only ones.
Yeah.
They're the last ones
Yeah.
that are EMD. 3-spindle machines.
3 discs.
That are hard drive and a floppy and an optical.
Right. Hard drive, floppy, and optical. Built into the machine. Right. You don't have to swap them out using the Ultra Bay.
Right.
Our focus is on running Arca OS on modern hardware. That's our, now that doesn't mean that if you have a 15-year-old laptop that installed fine, it's been running fine, and you installed an update and something broke after you installed the update, that you shouldn't open a ticket for us. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that if you're in the process of installing and you're having odd problems on a machine of that vintage, it may very well be nothing that we can fix. That's kind of what I'm saying. David and I routinely use machines of this vintage, so it doesn't mean that we can't run on it. It's just that, you know, when I start running into problems like that, I rip out the motherboard and replace it because it's probably got a leaky cap on it or a hairline crack or something like that. So, any more questions? Everyone's clear on the optimal environment for Arca OS is that in which it will boot. So if it will boot traditional BIOS, that's the optimal environment for your machine. And if you've got 508 running on a machine now and you want to use that same machine for Arca OS 5.1, then traditional BIOS mode is fine. Do your upgrade, and you're all set. Stick with it. It's great. If you want to revamp the layout and you want to install something like Windows 11 on that particular machine, think twice, because if it's running Arca OS under traditional BIOS mode, maybe it's not very well suited to Windows 11. That's
Or you
something
won't
else.
even be able to install it on older machines.
What's that?
It won't install on older machines.
No, I really won't.
Yeah, it's, you know, so your issues sort of flip around in that case. If you want to keep using that machine, you're probably better off to just stick with it as an Arca OS only machine. But on the upside, that means that you'll get that many more years of use out of that hardware without having to trash it. Particularly if it has something on it that you like the keyboard.
You know, that's one of the other big things.
Finding machines with decent keyboards these days, portable machines with decent keyboards these days it's really difficult.
I got 3 of the old clickety-clack keyboards. Anybody remember CL57? That was the original ThinkPad, the first one in the family, which had typewriter keys on it, you know, they went clicky clack, clicky clack.
Yeah,
clicky
that-
clack. I had 5 of those machines.
Mechanical
They all gave
buckle.
up finally.
So everyone's
Yeah,
feeling a little
everybody's waiting for my presentation tomorrow.
good. Yes, good. I got everyone primed now. All of your questions will be answered tomorrow.
Just kidding.
That's what I should have added to this slide.
The expectation is too much.
I don't wanna have other.
David, you got another question now?
Well, I have this little tiny thing I got, and I didn't even think to check that legacy stuff, I assumed it wouldn't have it, so I just installed it and it runs fine.
Great.
But I checked and it does have it.
That's interesting. I would be interested to know how well it works that way, and also how much RAM you have, system RAM
I
you have.
checked that, it's just under 4 gig, like 3.
Really?
Yeah.
UEFI, and it's showing the full complement of RAM under 4
Yeah, yeah.
gigs.
Same here.
Wow.
What's the
It all
number?
depends
Nice.
on the use.
Really? Same on your machine? Excellent.
Oh, it's not an idea, it's
This
just
thing.
I don't get that on my T590. I get like 1.7.
computer in the box.
But is there another way of turning off UEFI than turning on or off
It's and
UEFI than the CSM? Was there
Either.
something
The
else?
CSM does not turn UEFI on or off.
Okay.
The CSM can run, depending on what your BIOS offers you,
You go into Amazon.
you may be able to enable or not enable the CSM with UEFI or without UEFI.
Well,
Without UEFI, the CSM is automatically turned on.
Right.
16 gigabyte and a terabyte.
When UEFI is enabled, then you often will have the option of enabling CSM.
You're running on 5.1 on that?
You have to look at the system BIOS and see what options it offers you.
No, anyway.
Yeah, I did, that's the only one I found.
Sometimes we recommend that if you have the ability, if you're installing in UEFI, under UEFI, and you have the ability of enabling the CSM, you should enable the CSM. That's our general guideline. Some people have reported to us that they get a little bit more memory without the CSM turned on than with the CSM turned on. I don't know if that little bit of memory is worth it. We haven't done any benchmarks, performance benchmarks, with or without. But the recommendation is turn it on if you can.
This laptop has it, if you switch the CSM on, you get a penalty of losing 256 megabytes of RAM.
256 megs you lose.
I've seen other systems where it seems to make almost no difference, so it really depends on how the firmware is implemented.
Yeah, right.
Interestingly, this one here with UEFI,
Mhm.
when you first boot up, it's got the boot, the boot thing. If you got the CSM on, it's big screen. If you don't, it's a little bitty.
Interesting.
On my other one, it's just the reverse. If you turn on the CSM, it's a little bitty, but if you use the NCS, it's.
And this is the reason why we can't publish specific recommendations as to what should work for all machines, because what we're finding is there are so many variations.
And both those are Lenovo machines, just in different.
Yeah, so it's not even the manufacturer. It's not even the manufacturer. So try it and see what works.
After you buy the hardware, then try the operating system.
Your baseline is traditional BIOS. If you can do a traditional BIOS install and you have no need to use UEFI, then stick with traditional BIOS install, because that is the most the most compatible environment for OS2. That's really the rule of thumb. Anything else? Excellent. Now that I'm way over time, thank you very much.